Welcome back to the LINX 3.0 tutorial series. I'm Ken Sharp with LabVIEW MakerHub, and in this tutorial we'll be discussing how to create a web interface for your LabVIEW application. So when you're developing a LabVIEW application, you usually develop and debug it in what we call interactive mode. So that's when you hit the run arrow on a VI and it deploys down to a BeagleBone Black or Raspberry Pi target, and you can see the VI's front panel and debug the block diagram. And when you're done developing your application, you usually build that app into a startup executable. But at that point, you lose the ability to use the VI's front panel as a UI. So one of the ways that you can create a new UI for your application is with LabVIEW Web Services. So this allows you to use a normal web browser to access the user interface of your application when it's built as a startup executable. So to demonstrate how to do that, I've created an application which is a mashup of several LINX examples. The blink LED example and the thermistor read, so a temperature sensor read example. I'll be running it on a BeagleBone Black that you can see here, and I have an LED and a temperature sensor wired up to it. But this could be run on a Raspberry Pi as well. It's important not to focus too much on this application. Really, it's a toy application to demonstrate something that has both an input and an output that we can create a web interface for. But the details of the application aren't that important. You'll be building a web interface for your specific application. So it's just the important thing is to focus on the techniques that we talk about with the web interface. So let's go over the application a little bit just so you're familiar with it as we add a web interface to it. So on the block diagram, you can see there's a digital write LINX VI that writes to a digital output line that's connected to an LED. Next to it, we have a thermistor read VI. So that's an analog input that reads and does some calculations to convert a voltage reading to a temperature. So the only major thing I've modified about this is instead of having controls and indicators tied to those two VIs, I have changed those to be attached to a global variable. The reason I did this will become clear soon, but the main idea is that I want to be able to control the LED value that's being fed to the digital write VI, and I want to be able to access the temperature that's read using the thermistor read VI from a separate VI. So there are many ways in LabVIEW to communicate between different VIs. A global is just one of them, and it's just the one I'm using here. You can feel free to use any method you want. Now, the reason we need to communicate to another VI is that we're going to create a LabVIEW Web Service, which will be executed as another LabVIEW VI. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go back to my project and right-click on the target, I can choose New Web Service. That creates a new item under the LabVIEW project. We can type in a name. I'll give you a hint here. It's a good idea to keep this name short because it will be part of the URL that we'll access later to access the web service. So I'm just going to call it WS. Next, to create a specific web service, we'll right-click on Web Resources and say New VI. That will create a new VI for us. And if we open the block diagram to that VI, you can see it's mostly blank. Now what we want to do here is create something that will essentially a URL will call this VI when it's accessed, and this URL will be served up from the BeagleBone Black in this case. So we want to create one first for the LED. And when we access this URL, we want to be able to write a value to the LED, either turn it on or off. So first, let's add the global variable that we're using in our main VI. So we'll right click to open the palette, and we'll go down to select a VI. We'll go to our main project folder, and I already have that VI, or the global VI created. So we'll select that one. It's called global 1 VI in my case. And I'll say OK. We'll drop that on the block diagram. Now I want to write a value to this, so it's already set up to receive a value. So next, let's right click on the input terminal to that global, and we'll say create control. So that will create a new control on our front panel. I'm going to rename this control to something shorter. Now the name of this control will actually be used when we're interacting with the URL. So we want to keep it short, and preferably something without spaces in it. So I'm just going to call it value. Now here's an important part. If we want something tied to the URL, the way that we do that is we connect it to the connector pane. So in this case, the value control is an input to this VI. So we'll mark it as such. And now when we access the URL, if we pass values to the URL correctly, they will actually appear here in the control on the block diagram. And in this case, they'll get sent to the global variable, which will then be received by our main VI and written using the LINX digital write VI, and hopefully change the LED value. Okay, so that's it for the VI. That's all the functionality we need. Now we just need to save the VI. So I'll choose File, Save. Now it'll ask me to give it a name. Now again, the name of this VI will be included as part of our URL. So we want to keep it short and something meaningful. So in this case, I'm just going to call it led.vi. We'll hit OK to save that. OK, and that's our web service. So to test it, all we need to do is run our main VI. I'm going to close the block diagram for now. So we'll go ahead and run that. Okay. Now, to enable the web service, we'll right-click on our web service in our project, and we'll say Start. It's important to note that the web interface and your main application are deployed as two separate steps, and they're independent. You can run one without the other. Now you'll notice this dialog popped up, and it's telling us that the web service is running and that it's running on port 8001. So we'll want to note down the port that it's using, because we'll need that here right now. So I'll say OK. So now our web service, our web interface, and our main application are currently running. So to test it, we can just open our web browser, and this can be any web browser. In this case, I'm using Firefox, but it doesn't really matter what web browser you use. Anything should work. And now I'm going to type in http:// and then the IP address or hostname of my BeagleBone Black. And then we're going to type :8001 because that was the port that the web service is running on. And then we're going to type a slash, and we're going to say the web service name, which is WS, and then the specific web service VI's name, which was LED. And now here's the fun part. We can pass a value that will actually get sent in on the connector pane. So in this case, our control is called value, and it's a Boolean, and I'm going to give it a value of 1. So I'm going to say value equals 1. So the stuff after the question mark there, that's called the query string, and that's how you pass values to the VI. This is pretty standard web stuff. This isn't anything that we invented. This is a standard way of passing values to any website. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit return to go to that URL. So it came back and it gave me a response. There's nothing meaningful in it, but that's okay. That's what we expected. But if you look at the video, you'll notice that the LED just, sorry for that pop-up, the LED just changed values, so just turned on. So now let's see if we can turn it off. We'll set that value equal to 0 and hit return again. And yes, it did indeed turn off. So our web service is working. So that's great. Okay, so I'm going to minimize the browser now. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the main application. And likewise, I'm going to right-click on the web service, and I'm going to say stop there as well. So now that's stopped. Everything's shut down on the target. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add a web service to read or to access our thermometer reading. So in order to do that, I'm going to, again, right-click on Web Resources and choose New VI. So that, again, opens a blank VI for me. So once again, we're going to open the palette and choose Select a VI, and we're going to choose that global variable again. We want to access the other element of the global. So right now it's set to the LED value. We don't want that though. We want the thermometer value. So let's click on that and choose temperature. The other thing is we want to read from that global variable. So let's refer back to our main applications block diagram. And you'll notice here that inside the loop, we're reading a value from the temperature sensor and then writing it into the global. So we should have a valid temperature reading in that global. So we want to read the value out of that global. So we're going to right-click and choose Change to Read. And now we're going to hover over the terminal, the output terminal of that global, right-click, and choose Create Indicator. Now let's go back to the front panel for the web service VI. Oh, and let's move that indicator to someplace better to see. Okay, so now once again, we're going to tie this to the connector pane, and that's what will tell the web service what values it should be reading and writing. So this is an output, so we'll connect it to the connector pane on the right side. That's just a common LabVIEW convention. And now our web service VI is done. So we're going to hit Control S to save it. And again, we're going to give it a more meaningful name because this is going to be in our URL when we test it. So let's call it temp.vi. And I'll hit OK to save that. Okay, so now that web service VI is complete. So now let's look at something else. Before we start up the web service and test it out, let's right-click on the web service and go to Properties. So this opens up a new dialog. And let's click on the HTTP method VI settings. So this is handy because we can see all of our web service VIs, and we can also see what URL those will be mapped to. By default, they're just the same as the name of the VI. So let's select the temp.vi that we have. So now you can do some more advanced things here. You can choose what sort of HTTP command is used with this. The default is get, and that's useful for most things. In some cases, you might want to use some of the other things like post. For our purposes, get it will be fine. The output type is important. So here, if we have an output, like in this case where we have the temperature, which will be output as part of the web service, we can choose what format that will take. So XML is useful for interacting with, if you're using data dashboard or something else that expects XML. Text is useful if it's just going to be a human that's reading it. It's just text and it's easy to see. And finally, JSON, the last one, is handy to use if you are accessing these values from JavaScript. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So for now, I'm going to choose JSON because I know later I'm going to be using JavaScript to access this. Now we can also go up here to Sitemap. So this is another selection in the left-hand side, and this will give you a nice table of all of your web service VIs and also the URL mappings. You can see all of them at once. So I think we're fine now that we've changed the output type for the temp VI. So I'm going to say OK. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and save the project. Okay, so now I'm going to close that block diagram again. And let's go ahead and run our main application. Okay, so that's running. And now let's start our web service. And again, we get that dialog that tells us that the web service is running on port 8001. So now let's go back to here, let me click OK on that dialog. And let's go back to our web browser. We'll open a new tab, and I'm just going to copy our previous URL and make some modifications to it. Now in this case, we don't have any inputs to this web service that we're interested in. So we're going to, again, start with the same beginning to the URL, the IP address or host name of the target, a colon, and then the port number that we got from that dialog, and then a slash, and then the web service name, in this case WS, and then another slash, and then the specific web service we want to access. So in this case, that will be, or should be, temp. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. There are no inputs to this VI, so I don't need to pass an additional query string. I'll hit return, and you can see this is a JSON output that's saying the temperature is 26.98. And I believe that's in Celsius, so that's probably about correct. Yes, that is Celsius. Actually, just for fun, let's go ahead and change that to Fahrenheit. And then let's go flip back to the web browser. And let's reload the current page. And you notice that it changes to Fahrenheit, so now it's 80 degrees, which, yeah, it's a little warm here. That feels about right. Okay, so it seems like our temperature and our LED web service are operating correctly. So that's great. Now we're going to do one more thing that should be useful. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our web service again, and I'm going to hit the stop button on the main application. And we're going to do something else here. So the web services as they are fine, but often those aren't the most pretty ways to access your application, and you might want something that looks a little better. So the nice thing is that we can add static HTML and other files to our web service, and we can, in those HTML files, if we choose to, we can use JavaScript to access the web services and create a nice looking or nicer looking HTML front panel, if you will. So learning JavaScript and HTML is a little bit beyond this tutorial. There are a lot of great resources online for learning those. For now, I've just done this cooking show style, and I already have an HTML file and some JavaScript written that will access these web services that we've just written and create a nicer interface. So the cool thing is that I can serve up those files, the JavaScript and the HTML, from the BeagleBone Black, and I can add them to the web service. So let's see how to do that. So let's right-click on the web service, and we can choose Add Public Content Folder. And so this will pop up a file dialog. Now I have created a folder inside my main application folder called www. You can call this folder anything you want. I just chose to call it www. And so I'm going to select that folder. So now we get a new item under our web service called public content. And under here I can see basically the contents of that www directory. So I have a main.html file, and again, I wrote that earlier, and then I've got some JavaScript in here. So now, if we go, oh sorry, I skipped a step. Let's go ahead and start our main application again. And let's start our web service once more. And again, we see that it's running from port 8001. Hit OK on that. Now let's go back to our web browser. And let's again copy our URL so I don't have to type that in again. And we'll open a new browser tab and paste that URL in. And now that file that I added was called main.html. So we're going to take the beginning of the URL as we did before, all the way up to the ws/, but now we're going to go to main.html. So let's hit return on that. So now we have a page, and what this is doing is it's going out and querying the temp web service to get the temperature, and then it's basically printing that out to the page. And then it's also accessing the LED web service, but only when I hit these buttons. So when I hit the LED on button, let's try that now. All right, and so you should see the LED just turned on, and now if I hit the LED off button, it turns back off again. So now I've got a nice HTML page where I can access all my web services at once. And I can make this HTML page as fancy as I want to. You can get crazy with this. You can add images, add more JavaScript, add even more HTML files that link together, things like that. Basically anything you can do on a regular website that you might design, you can do here, and you can serve those files up. So this hopefully shows you kind of a handy way of creating a user interface for your application. So now let's talk about one last thing before we wrap up. I'll minimize the web browser. And let's go ahead and stop the web service. Stop. So here I've created a build spec for my application in order to create a standalone executable. So there was a previous tutorial that taught us how to create a startup executable. So I won't go into how to do that again. But what I will talk about is if we open that up, open up the build spec properties dialog, there should be a checkbox now that we can enable the web service. So in the left dialog here in the category pane, there's a web services page. And so you'll notice now that I've created a web service in my project, there's a new item with my web service name. And what I can do is check that box to enable that web service. And then down below, we can set what port we want that web service to be available on. And so as soon as I enable this web service and rebuild my startup executable and redeploy it to the target, the startup executable will start the web service as well when it boots, which is really nice. So this is the way that you would create or deploy a web service with a startup executable.
Make sure to check out LabViewMakerHub.com for more tutorials and projects, and ask any questions you have on the MakerHub forums at LabViewMakerHub.com/forums.